Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill in good faith. And if you appreciate what we're doing here, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politicsandreligion, patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Your support through Patreon will really help us continue to have conversations like the one we're having today with Christy Smith. You may have heard me mention the name Christy Smith before. Christy was the California State Assembly member in my home district from 2018 through 2020. And we've also discussed the U.S. House District of California 25, which is now California 27. The current representative, Republican Mike Garcia, won the district by, you guessed it, 333 votes. We've mentioned that before, out of over 340,000 that were cast. Well, Mike and Christy are running against each other again, and this time there are some differences, including we have Mike's voting record and public statements while in office, which seem to represent only the most extreme MAGA fringe, and not the entirety of this very purple district, but we'll get into that. We have many new listeners since the last time we spoke with Christy in the spring of 2021, so I'll give a brief intro, and then we'll dive right in. As mentioned, Christy previously served in California's State Assembly, where she authored 9 bills which became law, focusing on education reform, homeowner protections, college affordability, good governance, and protection for victims of human trafficking. Prior to the State Assembly, Christy served 2 terms as governing board member of the Newhall School District, notably helping to secure $60 million in resources for facility and technology upgrades for the school district. It's also worth noting that Christy graduated high school right here in Santa Clarita Valley, went to College of the Canyons before graduating from UCLA, and has raised a family right here in the district that she's running to represent in the U.S. Congress. Christy Smith, what an honor to have you on the program again. How are you?
I'm well. It's good to be with you again, Corey.
Yeah. So glad we could put it together. And we're in the heat of campaign season right now, so it's a pretty timely conversation.
Right.
Yeah. So for folks who aren't familiar with your background, would you mind giving us some of your backstory, where you were born, moving to Santa Clarita at an early age, and then some of those formative experiences growing up that continue to shape what drives you today?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually born in Würzburg, Germany, on an army base. My dad was in the military during Vietnam, was stationed in Germany doing some satellite work. And we didn't live there very long. So I was born there, an American citizen since I was born on base. But then we moved home when I was about 6 months old. Home at the time was Indiana. And so that's where I get, some of my Midwestern sensibilities, some of the principles you and I share in common, I think come from that Midwest upbringing for a little while. And then my dad was offered a job opportunity here in California in 1979. What I hadn't talked about a lot previously, because both of my parents were still with us, was the fact that, theirs was a marriage that was pretty fraught with domestic violence and some untreated mental health issues that really kind of shaped where we went as a family and how things went here. So we struggled. My parents eventually separated. My mom raised us, a single mom raising 3 kids, which, in any area of LA or in California is quite an economic challenge, was back then, still is today. And we had a lot to overcome as a family, but we did. And part of what drew me to public service was the notion that government does have an important role to play in putting a safety net under people who go through, extreme circumstances and have challenges to face, to make sure that they don't fall completely out of our social safety net. And there's a lot of improvement we need to make on that right now, with so many people being unhoused and facing challenges and needing mental health help, things that they can't get access to, that frankly we could do better at. So continue to be inspired by the prospect of what good government can do for people in that respect, especially when it comes to education. You mentioned the fact that, I went to a community college. So did my mom, actually. That's how she got herself out of a circumstance where she was facing abuse, is she was able to go to our local community college, get a nursing degree to be able to have a job that would, support 3 kids. And so because I didn't have money to go to a 4-year university right out of high school, I went to that same community college and then was able to transfer and go to UCLA. We need to continue to expand those kind of opportunities. We need to shore up all of our local neighborhood K through 12 schools and make sure they're the best possible learning environments for our young ones. But then, from there, we need to continue to connect people with opportunities that are affordable, that don't bind them with decades of debt, in their pursuit of making their own lives better. So, all things that are super, super important to me. You mentioned heat. We are in the heat of this campaign, but we are in the heat of a sustained heat wave here in California, along with a drought, which indicate the absolute dire need to do more on climate change, and urgently. It's an absolute emergency at this point. So another big area of public policy that motivates me.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because my oldest kid, Savannah, who you met that first day that we met at the Home and Garden Show, Savannah made sure that I ask you about that a little bit later in the conversation. So we'll get to that. I'm glad you brought it up. But since you brought up a little bit of your educational journey, I'd love for you to go into that a little bit more, and whether your own experience was influential in that becoming a central tenet of your own political activism.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Not only did I go to the local community college because it's what I could afford. And back then, a semester's worth of full-time tuition was $50, plus your books and your ancillary fees. So you could do a semester of community college for about, $500, give or take, given the books. But while I was on campus, I also needed to work to be able to support myself. So through all of my college experience, I was working at least 2 jobs and sometimes 3. But of the jobs that I had, a couple of them were on campus. And I started out doing a little bit of time in the financial aid office. But then a job I absolutely loved is that I became a peer mentor in a program called EOPS. And that was partnering first generation, particularly English language learner students, with someone on campus who could help them navigate the process. And it was work that really proved to me the structural barriers in place for people looking to pursue higher education and to be able to stick with it. A number of the students that I helped really had some very, very dire circumstances and challenges that, while I was able to help connect them with the financial aid office or tutoring that they might need, kind of the other things in their life, whether it was, childcare issues or needing to work to help support the family business, there were things that just simply kept people from being in the classroom and pursuing their educational goals. So that was compelling for me, as was being elected in my early 20s as the union leader for the classified employees at the college, negotiating my first union contract in my early 20s on behalf of several hundred employees there at the college. Also really solidified my support of worker rights and collective bargaining. So it was a formative experience all the way around, the character building of having to work that hard to put myself through school, but now realizing it is not realistic. I mean, people now can't pay for a whole semester of school, no matter how many jobs they're working, right? And keep a roof over their head, even if they are doing the 3 jobs. When you've got tuition in the tens of thousands of dollars, it's just out of reach for so many people. So understanding how much more work we need to do, again, to connect people with opportunities that doesn't drown them in debt. And, there's the ability to go on to UCLA, one of the top public universities in the country, and finish a degree in political science with a lot of really great professors who were highly motivating, just kept me kind of in this space of understanding just how significant the role of public policy work can be in people's lives, and contrasting that with where we are now, where both sides of the political spectrum, I think, used to have a healthy respect for the lane that government can and should be in. And now really having so many folks focused on what are endless culture wars instead of a focus on good public policy and good expenditures of public money, of taxpayer money.
Yeah. So a lot of follow-up questions there. One of which was you might have just buried one of our leads here. So you negotiated a union contract. You must have been in your early 20s at that point. How did you learn about unions and contracts and negotiation? How did you learn all you needed to do to effectively lead that negotiation?
Research, asking people. I was new to it. And there was a lot of support from within the institution of the union itself at the local and state level. And then working with, my colleagues who were also classified employees to kind of establish what our priorities were, learn what the prior precedent was for negotiations, where we wanted to go, and then having the great good fortune because of College of the Canyon's amazing leadership throughout the years of having a supportive administrative team who really wanted to get to yes on as many of those bargaining issues as they could, because they did truly value their staff and knew how important a happy staff was to a good education experience for the students there. So, it was a pretty steep learning curve. It was a fast learning curve, but I was surrounded by great people and we got the job done. Yeah.
Now, I do remember that you mentioned at one point you identified as a Republican, or you didn't fully, is that right?
Yeah. And it was about that time when I first started college. I was a registered Republican. So my first election, I still have a Bush Quayle t-shirt from a rally. My first election, I actually voted Republican.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I bring it up because you brought up, endless culture wars and these things that get in the way of really having productive conversations across our political dispositions in order to achieve good public policy. But I do want to dig in a little bit on a current I don't know if you could call it a policy as much as an action. Biden's recent action on student debt. Do you have any views on the action that he took, and do you think that it's going to stick?
Yeah, I mean, it was critically important, and I can personalize it so much. So my youngest daughter is a first-year, first-grade teacher. And so her dad and I took out some loans to be able to support her undergraduate degree. We said the teaching credential and the rest of your education is on you. And so she's got some debt, she's got some loans, but she's also got a teacher's starting salary. So for her, the amount of loan debt that she had meant about 30% of her income in these first few years was going to be going to pay down her student debt. And now having some relief from that means she's much more likely to be able to stay in the profession. And we need teachers. We need teachers all across this country, Florida and a couple of other states especially. But it's exactly those kind of professions, the skilled professions, your medical professionals and others, where it takes several years of training and experience and a very expensive debt if you're borrowing some or all of that to complete that education. And people graduate from those programs unable to really see their way clear to when they're going to have any kind of disposable income, let alone, keep food on the table and keep a roof over their head. So it's important, it's meaningful. And now what I really appreciate about the president and our current Secretary of Education, Cardones, is that they understand this can't be a one and done prospect, right? We've got to get to the heart of what's driving these costs and bring the costs down for everybody while expanding opportunities to have better Pell Grant support and other non-loan support for getting people through college.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about something. When I first became aware of your career in public service, I think it was when you were on the Hart School District. You were serving on the board there. There was one particular charter school where there was great contention. My brother would kill me if I didn't at least ask you if your views on this charter school movement have evolved over the last few years.
No, they've been what they always were. When I started at the U.S. Department of Education during the Clinton administration, it was the infancy of the charter school movement. And what charters were this potential for dynamic groups of teachers and administrators to kind of break the mold within a traditional school district setting and try to move the needle for student achievement. And so they were kind of set free from some of the bureaucratic parameters that sometimes got in the way, frankly. What unfortunately it expanded into in some quarters was an opportunity for private interests to have their hands in the public till. By no means is that every charter. A lot of charters are doing great things and are an important part of the county or local school district that they are a part of. But what we need to make sure we continue to do is not have it be about a profit motive at any school, but about a student achievement and student success model. And so as long as we keep driving in that direction, we're going to be in a good spot. But the other thing that we did, though, is kind of lose the thread of, again, making sure every neighborhood public school is a good school. And we need to be mindful of the fact that when there is a charter that happens in any school district, especially in areas like California, where funding is based on student attendance, there is a redistribution of resources. And in that redistribution, we need to make sure that we're not leaving any student behind. So again, charters are an important part of a lot of districts. They're performing well. They're doing what they intended. You look at Granada Hills Charter High School here in the district, and they've been academic decathlon champions time and time again, right? We know they're moving the needle there, but we need to make sure that every student who is meant to be served, in terms of both federal and state policy, so that's our special ed kids and kids with unique challenges, that they're getting the same level of service, and that when those resources are redistributed across a district, that we're not leaving any kids behind.
Hey, I just wanted to take a quick minute to tell you about a podcast I think you'll really like. It's called Preconceived. It's a show hosted by Zale Mednick that examines the preconceptions that shape how we view the world and challenges the paradigms by which we live our lives. On each episode of Preconceived, Zale talks to researchers, experts, and other luminaries to examine both our approach to major life choices, but also our perspectives on topics to which we may have been overly conditioned towards certain opinions. We think you'll especially enjoy episode 66, Unorthodox, Leaving Extremist Religion with Gene Steinberg, founder of Freedom. There are so many others that you can really dig into. There's episode 44 about helicopter parents, how to raise an adult with the former Stanford dean. There's one about polyamory with a sociologist and an expert researcher on the topic. There's one about the malleability of human memory with a psychologist and a memory expert. There's so many others that you'll really appreciate and enjoy. So listen to Preconceived wherever you get your podcasts. These are all intertwined issues, and we could talk about this for a couple hours alone. As you might remember, I come from a family of educators. My mother, 35 years in the kindergarten room. My father was a guidance counselor, teacher, as well as worked for the school district in New York City, working in conflict resolution. My brother, my uncle, all educators. And one of the tensions, even for folks who are part of the union, in fact, my parents are both retired and benefit from their union membership, lifelong union membership. One of the tensions there is that everybody knew in every school that they were in who the bad teachers were. And yet one of the things, the union provided a great many benefits, but it seemed like every union fight that came up, the idea of merit-based pay grades was just a non-starter. There's any number of issues along those lines where there's this tension between, something that you expressed before about, it's hard to, come out, get a degree, oftentimes having to get a graduate degree, and then be faced with a teacher's salary, which, let's face it, especially in California, isn't quite going to give you a middle-class income. But so there are these tensions between wanting to figure out ways of paying teachers more, bottom line, versus some of the tensions that are built in from largely unionized trade. Do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, it all comes down to pay for me. I mean, the more you pay people, the better the quality of candidate that you are going to attract. But I haven't found it to be the case that school districts aren't very serious about supporting good instruction. I think that's a mythology that's been bandied about a lot, and laying the blame and the responsibility at teachers' doorstep instead of the societal challenges that most of our kids are walking into the classroom with. You can't claim that somebody is a bad teacher when they've got a classroom of 30 kids and 10 of them speak a language that's not English as their first language, regardless of what grade they're in. And several of them are probably on some kind of IEP, which is for kids with special challenges, end up with that kind of learning plan, where several of them might be at home in domestic circumstances that give them a little bit of trauma that they bring into the classroom with them. Kids who may not have had, a meal that morning before they come to school for whatever the reason is. Thank goodness here in California now we're now providing those meals to all of our kids. But to lay that entirely at teachers' feet at a time when our school district budgets have been brought down to the bare bones, you're talking about not enough school psychologists, not enough librarians, not enough aides in the classroom. The teachers are at a real disadvantage right now. So not only are they woefully underpaid, they're underhelped, they're undersupported. And we need to get a real understanding of the challenges our kids are walking into the classroom with and get a better handle on that in order to support our teachers while also incentivizing them. And if there are some challenges that they face instructionally in a classroom, maybe they've changed grade levels or year after year, there might be a persistent challenge. There are ways around that. And that's what really talented leadership teams do. They can help re-educate, retrain teachers who are, later into their career. But right now, Frank, we're just losing teachers. The best time to lose a new teacher is in the first 5 years. Fewer than 60% persist right now. And so we have a real challenge on our hands, but it's going to come from supporting the profession publicly by acknowledging their worth and their training with a better salary, and then giving them the supports in place that they need, given the challenges of the modern classroom and the modern student.
Yeah, no. And just to clarify a comment that I made sort of in passing about everybody knew who the bad teachers were. Listen, I've been to those schools and, like I said, my family has been in education. So 95, if not 99% of teachers that I know are really committed to their craft. But there is that, small percentage of folks who frankly are just mailing it in. And the whole school, the whole staff, the whole faculty knew who those folks were, but there wasn't, kind of to one of the points that you're making, there wasn't necessarily the support or the accountability to provide those teachers the training to get past whatever it was that the wall that they were hitting. And now, listen, there's more obstacles than ever.
Right.
There's screaming parents who get a bug up their orifice about whatever it might be. They listened to a news program and decided that they don't want their kids to learn about critical race theory as third graders, as if that was ever happening in the first place. But that's another story. Sorry, I'm going off the rails here. So how did you first decide when did you first decide to get into politics?
In fifth grade. And, I was that nerdy kid in elementary school, and you get that first bite of American history and the founding of our country and the Constitution and democracy and all of its incredible potential. Mistakes in the past too, mistakes that we had to acknowledge and try to continue to grow and learn from, but just kind of that profound sense of, oh my gosh, this is kind of the coolest thing ever. And so it's been a calling for a long time. Didn't always necessarily think it would be an elected office. And that's why I started early, in my career in just straight policy work. But I'm still compelled, and I still have that same faith and that same vision that the roadmap that the founders laid out for us is still the right path. We just have to ask some of the bigger, more expansive questions now to make sure that we stay on that path and preserve democracy.
I'm glad that you did set out on this path, and it's encouraging. Even though, as we've discussed from our very very first meeting, we have differences politically, some positions that we hold. But that's okay. That's, as you said in our very first meeting, that's what democracy is all about, figuring out how to, be neighbors and how to be represented across these differences, which I give you a lot of credit for including me specifically in your small business committee when you were in the state assembly. I did want to ask you, though, things are different now than when you first ran for office.
Yeah.
How is life out on the trail compared to your first run for Congress, or even, when you first ran for the assembly?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a real commentary on our times. I think out on the trail, it's absolutely pleasant. Meeting people face to face, even people who don't agree with you, they're kind, they're civil, they're respectful. Whereas in the social media space, it can be pretty ugly. I had to report a couple of comments over the weekend for inappropriate content, and people just feel so unrestrained in their commentary in those spaces. And so, I'm still hopeful, though, because again, when I'm out in the community, when I am face to face with people, even those who don't disagree, we can agree to disagree and still move forward in a conversation. So I think that people are exhausted. I mean, COVID itself was exhausting, but kind of that, really contentious hyper partisanship that gripped us for so long. I feel like we're finally starting to break free of that. And people really are much more interested in reestablishing a sense of community. And so that's what makes me hopeful.
How are you able to campaign differently this time as opposed to 2020? I mean, we all kind of lived through the zombie apocalypse, so we know where we were, but specifically your campaign strategies, your day-to-day, how different does that look?
Yeah, I mean, look, we made a decision across the board as a Democratic Party in the 2020 cycle, not to canvass door to door and not to hold in-person events. So the extent of in-person events that I was able to hold in that campaign were literally drive-throughs. We would choose a parking lot, let people know we were going to be there, masks up, they stay in their car, I stay 6 feet away, and they're able to ask me questions. That was the extent of voter interaction that we could have in 2020. And now this cycle would, thankfully, vaccinations getting in enough arms and seeing our infection rates going down, we're able to do traditional campaigning again, which is door-to-door canvassing, in-person events, and really being face-to-face with people again. And it's changed the energy and the dynamic of the campaign for sure.
Yeah. Now, going back just a little bit, I did want to ask you, so you've faced some tension, it's, as you say, it's pretty fraught out there at times, frankly, even reading some of the comments on threads that Mike Garcia, your opponent, puts out, it makes me cringe. I obviously have grave differences, specifically as it comes to his votes to overturn the election. But, he's still my neighbor. He's still somebody I might see out in a soccer field or at a chamber event. And it's important that we keep things civil and not cross certain lines of civility and these airs of threat and violence. How's your family dealing with that?
Oh, thanks. They've tuned it out a lot more this cycle. Frankly, they've all had to put their social media on lockdown, and they really don't look at a lot because it's hard and it's hurtful. It's hard to not respond. So, but they've been good. They know that that's part of their job. That's the assignment, you try to tune it out and let me do the hard work of being out front. But it's unfortunate. You've lived here a long time like I have. And this is a community. Like you said, we're getting together on the soccer fields and the baseball things and all the numerous nonprofit organizations here that raise money for really incredible causes. We're all in rooms together a lot. And we need to be able to get back to a point where that doesn't feel uncomfortable if someone who has disagreed with you on Facebook, is at the next table.
Yeah, no. And to your point, I've had plenty of Republicans on this program, local Republicans, Bill Miranda, when he was mayor, and Scott, he's finishing out his term as state senator. So, and, listen, when I see any number of folks across party lines, it's always nice to be able to give a smile and a handshake and talk about them Dodgers and how my Mets beat the Dodgers last time around. So stuff like that. But so speaking of, I did want to get into a little bit of politics. By many accounts, suburban college educated women will be a major factor in this race. But in California 27, many college educated women are Christians who attend theologically conservative churches and who've never voted for someone with a D before their name. So while I don't believe realistically large percentages of those folks will vote differently, some might. I have this it's not imaginary. I went to this Sunday school class at Grace Baptist for the better part of 10, 15 years. And whether it was 20 people in that classroom or 30 people in that classroom after main church, the main church service, I'm here to tell you, not all of them are going to change their vote, but there is 1, 2, maybe 3 of those folks who are persuadable. So if you're visiting my old Sunday school class at Grace, what might you say to those folks to persuade the 1 or 2 who are persuadable that this time it's okay, if not imperative, to vote for a candidate with a D before her name?
Sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's about action on issues that we care about. Number 1, saving our democratic institutions. And that is important to Americans across the board. And not every religious persuasion necessarily ties to a political persuasion. There's a lot of diversity there, but across the board, Americans, and this has now popped as the number 1 issue when people are polled in this election cycle, what matters to you most? It's saving our democratic institutions. And that means the right to vote. and the idea that state legislatures cannot overturn the will of the people within their state when it comes to a presidential election. Those two things are key. So making sure that we are defending the franchise to vote, expanding that franchise, making it as easy as possible to vote, given the constraints of modern life and how hard it is sometimes to show up on a Tuesday, which in some states, that's what they're limited to, right? But how many more states can we get to go the way of California, where every registered voter gets a vote by mail ballot? We need to make it easy to vote in America and defend that as an important American value. And the other thing I would say is on issues where we may disagree, to understand that I would be an elected official whose ear you will still have. You will still have a seat at the table to express your difference of opinion, because that's how I learn. That's how I become a better policymaker, to find out what your difference is about and what it's based on, and go from there. And maybe some of the times we're, again, like you and I have, agree to disagree, but you will deserve to be heard as someone who is my constituent, and also to fundamentally understand and know that I respect your religious beliefs. I am someone who was raised in both a Methodist and Baptist household. Dad was a Baptist, mom was a Methodist. I grew up going to church. I have reverence for the importance of the teachings of all religions in people's lives, and what that brings to bear on what their political philosophy is. And it's not something we should shy away from talking about, frankly. It's an important part of who we are. I still very also strongly believe in defined separation of church and state, but that doesn't mean that we don't understand that people's own religious personal philosophy doesn't inform certain positions that they take.
It's interesting because you sort of intuitively went to my next question. And for the record, I've invited Congressman Mike Garcia to this program multiple times with no response. But and if he comes on and I ever do get a chance to have a conversation with him, whether it's on the program or not, I would share these concerns. One of my gravest critiques of Congressman Garcia is that he doesn't truly represent California 27. So for those that aren't familiar with this district, we've talked about it a little bit before, but this is not Georgia 14, where the infamous MTG represents an 80% red district. This is California 27, where it was California 25 when Mike won by 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, but 1/10 of 1%, a purple district. Yet Mike, in his voting record and virtually all of his public statements, exhibits time after time that he only represents, frankly, a radical MAGA fringe of today's Republican Party. And not only does he not represent the rest of his constituency, if you look at his Twitter feed or his Fox News or Fox Business hits, he consistently expresses a disdain for those who are outside of that extremist wing. So not talking about political strategy, but actual representation here. You kind of alluded to it before. This district has been represented by a Republican every term since 1993, with the exception of Katie Hill's tenure from 2019 to 2020. So how would you represent folks who don't typically vote for Democratic candidates? And how would you be sure to include voices of the folks in this district who are often on the other side of political issues than you?
Sure. As I did before, when I was in the state legislature and when I was on the school board, you have a role to play as an elected representative of an entire community, and that is to throw the doors open wide and to hear everyone and to serve everyone the same with respect to constituent services. And what I have found over all of my years of public service is what voters appreciate the most, even if they disagree with you on an issue, if they understand what your guiding principles are, where those guardrails are in place that define who you are and how you're going to make decisions. So, some of the conversations we've already had, I will always be a staunch defender of the institutions of our democracy, the right to vote, a protected right to vote, and ensuring that state legislatures can't override the will of the people in a national election, that I will always stand up for and defend Social Security and Medicare as the most important anti-poverty programs in American history. Those are bright lines for me. The need to move on the climate crisis and environmental action are bright lines for me, and things that I think are evidence-based and compelling. When you explain that to voters, they understand and they say, okay, I would like to give you my point of view on X, Y, Z of those things, but I understand where you're coming from. And I think when you are clear about the overarching principles, people appreciate it.
Yeah. And just to attest, because I am in this district and you did represent me as a state assembly member, number one, the result of our initial conversation, you did invite me, and I thought, frankly, you were giving me lip service, but it was a very real thing to come and join in those discussions in the Small Business Committee. We had several meetings, and again, we probably ended up still having differences majority of the time, but I did see language, if I remember correctly, language specifically pertaining to workers' comp and how we could, there were some dominoes that we could move around, if you will, to help with regard to as minimum wage was rising to mitigate some of the effects of small business owners. So again, we still ended up deferring on a number of things, but just being able to have the conversation and discovering areas of actual policy that we could agree upon, and that I felt heard and I felt represented. So the other things I did want to affirm here, just as an engaged citizen and as a voter, this isn't just rhetoric that we're talking about protecting the democratic process. Folks voted to about 150 Republican representatives voted to overturn the elections in Pennsylvania on the evening of January 6th, and then the Electoral College votes of Arizona on January 7th. Mike was one of them. Right. Mike's votes since then have represented that he's just doubled down again and again. In the Congress's committee to investigate what happened on January 6th, there was a vote taken in Congress to subpoena Steve Bannon. To me, that was just such low-hanging fruit for Mike to indicate that he really cared about the democratic process and cared about Congress's role in oversight. And just vote after vote after vote, there were things, but also there are things. It's not just about looking at January 6th. It's very real. Maybe not necessarily here in California, but we have to be diligent to look for candidates. There are state attorneys general. There are state secretaries of state who are controlling the democratic process, who are election deniers. So. Right.
Yeah, no, county level officials. And, this was what was so galling to me in the days after our race was finally decided. And it was one of the last in the country to be decided, again, because we had two county officials, one Republican elected official in Ventura County, and then an appointed official, nonpartisan official in LA County, but appointed by an all Democratic, nearly Board of Supervisors, one Republican. Those officials went out of their way to have this be as transparent and accountable a process as one could hope for as a candidate and as a voting citizen. Every attempt was made to rectify every ballot that had any kind of an issue. If it had been ripped, if the signature couldn't be validated and matched, both campaigns were given the same opportunity with our attorneys present in the room to go reach out to those voters to cure every single one of those ballots right up until the last official moment of ballots being counted before the vote had to be certified. So for him to have then gone on to the extreme media outlets that he did after that and call into question the validity of not only our election, but elections across the country when he had lawyers in the room is really just insidious and wrong. It's just so wrong.
Yeah, there's something about on the campaign material and election integrity that's I don't know, it just gets under my skin. Come on, Mike, that's the de minimis. It's something that plays well on Fox Business or Fox News or OANN or.
Well, and look, we have to talk about the importance of truth in our elections now too. And unfortunately, I think we're at a moment where a lot of our main sources of media are letting us down in their, assignment as the fourth estate to get to truth, not to try to find balance where no balance exists, but to actually deliver truth and let people make that decision for themselves through a process of critical thinking. But when you've got one party that just flat out lies, I mean, the number of times that my opponent has voted against a major piece of legislation and then put his name on a piece of legislation that is a sound alike bill, like the Violence Against Women Act, like the Inflation Reduction Act. He's done it time and time again to try to make people believe that he's been on the right side when he's voted on the wrong side. And it's deceptive, it's dishonest, and it speaks of his profound level of disrespect for the voters in this district.
So you bring up an interesting point. It really is difficult to buck one's major party. Are there pieces of legislation or issues where you might have to take an independent stance against Nancy Pelosi or President Biden?
Yeah.
What would be
Sure.
some instances like that?
Absolutely. Well, you know what? You were speaking to it earlier about the work that we did together when you were on my business advisory committee. Out of that work, you're right, I did move kind of more aggressively in some workers' comp reform spaces that need to happen. Wish I could have stayed longer to be able to do that. But it was the one vote that I took against my party on a budget vote, which is a no-no. The caucus doesn't want you to vote against the caucus on a budget vote. You know it has consequences. So I had to call my assembly speaker the night before and say, I'm not going to be with you on this. Consequences will be what they will. But it was the ability for small businesses to claim their net operating loss during COVID. So we had our California Department of Public Health and federal health officials saying we needed to shut down in-person businesses. And we were talking about not letting business owners write down that loss in the upcoming tax years. That just was fundamentally wrong to me. And so I voted in opposition of my party. I lost a big committee assignment that I loved. I knew that would be a consequence. But if I had it to do over again, I would. It was the right vote to take to protect the greatest number of people when another budgetary alternative could have been offered up to meet that same need.
So there is a very real consequence for having to buck your own party. What are some of the other consequences that you might face as Congressperson Christy Smith with Speaker Pelosi or whoever the speaker might be in the next term?
Yeah, I mean, typically it's things like sometimes it's probably just a talking to, and that's when you've got your party whips, right? And they're doing their vote count, and they need you or they don't. What a lot of people don't realize, though, it's in these swing districts where you have the greatest amount of influence on any given policy, especially if the caucus needs your vote. You can really lean into that moment that your vote might be needed, but it comes at great political cost to you. And you can use that leverage to try to influence change in the bill itself by an amendment. Or by asking the author for a change. So it's a higher level sometimes of responsibility to come from a swing state. It's a challenge that I like because I love to explore upside down and right side up every policy that I look at and figure out, what are the unintended consequences, the unintended costs, and get to the best final version of a bill. But, you have to understand that sometimes when you do go against your party, it will come with a consequence.
So you point out that this is indeed a swing district, and I refer to it as a purple district. One of the other constituents or one of the other key groups in our district includes Latino voters. So Mike Madrid and Chuck Rocha, longtime national Republican and Democratic strategists, respectively, have both been talking for months and months about how more and more Latinos have been gravitating towards Republicans. The numbers just don't lie about that. Has your campaign done anything differently to try and reach this important group of voters?
Absolutely. Well, it's a group of voters, happily to say we won in the last cycle, but we don't take that for granted. So this campaign started with a listening tour, and we met with a number of our major both political and nonprofit Latino community organizing groups. I've continued to have ongoing dialogue with them about priorities for the community, going on and doing interviews on Spanish radio, being at events, making sure that we are available and accessible to the community. We'll continue to do that. We have a Latino issues roundtable coming up in the next couple of weeks in the district, and delivering. I think what has been the case in a number of, for lack of better word, subgroup communities is that cycle after cycle, people like me show up and we need your vote, we need your vote, we need your vote. And then nothing is delivered that materially improves the circumstances of their life, and nobody carries through or executes on those promises. And so it's a matter of really delivering for people and making sure that they understand that as voting members of the community, not simply because of the group they identify with, but because they are voters in this community, their vote really matters. And when they turn out, they change the narrative.
Right. Now, my oldest kid, Savannah, as mentioned, Savannah had a question for you. Savannah said, I'd really love to see Christy's climate change focus being on indigenous practices, lifting up native voices in that regard, and sustainable land management for the region. But anything climate action related is good. And Savannah said, let her know I said hello and thank you for listening to folks my age. So in terms of specific legislation or specific action, what kinds of initiatives will you be supporting in terms of climate change, especially in light of folks Savannah's age or your daughter's ages?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I love about Savannah's question. First and foremost, you're welcome. And remind all of your friends that if 18 to 30-year-olds vote, you change this election specifically. You really do. So please turn out and vote. But when it comes to climate, this is so personal, probably is for you too, with young kids at home. But I have two young adult daughters who, given the climate catastrophe that is looming, don't see a future for themselves that looks as bright or, I wouldn't say our lives were necessarily easy growing up, but this wasn't looming over us, in the 80s and 90s like it looms over these kids, that there are going to continue to be these significant climate catastrophes. And right now we see 30% of Pakistan underwater. We've seen significant flooding here in the United States. An entire United States city had been without drinking water for, a week because of flooding. And so we need to continue to move in the direction of clean, renewable energy nationally. We've got to get that infrastructure in place. We have to commit to it with everything in our heart and start to make that transition sooner rather than later. But we've really got to think about water too. And evidence shows us very clearly that we will continue to be challenged in that respect globally. Our own United States Defense Department says climate change is the single biggest threat to international security, safety, and security. And water is the leading cause there as nations find themselves without usable sources of water. That will be disastrous. And we're seeing it right here in the United States. And with respect to Savannah's concern for, the climate practices of indigenous peoples, she's spot on. And this is part of the reason I'm so grateful to have grown up in the Midwest for about 10 years, is that we really did a heavy emphasis on understanding indigenous cultures, and particularly their agricultural practices, their practices of restoring to the earth what you had taken from her. And we, just a few centuries of us getting away from that, and we find ourselves in really dire circumstances. There are countries who are doing it well, but it's reducing solid waste and a dependence on plastic packaging and being mindful about our water consumption. There are practical everyday things that we can do as individuals, but what we need to start requiring corporate and industrial America to do as well to be part of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah. So one other issue I did want to ask you about: a lot of LAPD and Sheriff's Department families live up in this district.
Right.
So I saw a National Republican Congressional Committee press release from last week. The primary argument they made at the top of the release was Smith believes we need to reform law enforcement by adding professionals like social workers, housing advocates, and drug abuse experts. And I thought, wait, is this a bad thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I think they were trying to attack you on the whole defund the police thing, but the way they were quoting you, your position actually sounds pretty reasonable. So did you want to,
right,
even for a conservative like me, like
I so appreciate this because the other side just lies. We're in a moment now where there's no way to be nice about it other than to say they're lying. I tweeted one time when the American Rescue Plan was being passed at Mike Garcia, saying, you talk about defund the police all the time. You're literally about to vote against a bill that will require our local county and city governments to reduce force because they will not have the resources to pay for those salaries. Like literally you personally are defunding the police right now. Not that I am in support of that, but my position on reform comes from the direct work that I was very privileged to do with our local sheriffs and especially our LAPD, who invited me for ride-alongs and conversations with officers and leadership about the challenges they face day in, day out in doing the work in the community. And they are doing the best that they can, but you're talking about officers who were not trained to be substance abuse advisors or mental health professionals or housing advocates, that it's not their role. And so they do it as part of their daily practice to help us keep our streets safe. But it's not training they have, and it's certainly not resources they've been connected to. And so good models of community policing integrate all of those supportive services across the county and give law enforcement officers the resources they need to be able to pass that call on to a professional who can help, and then move on to a call where they're solving a property crime or preventing a property crime, and doing things that really do keep us safe. And so it is just such a belligerently ignorant argument that the Republicans keep making that people don't support public safety. Of course we do. And by supporting public safety, that also means we support getting weapons of war off our streets. It is so ironic that they will, in the same week that a tragedy happens like the Uvalde shooting, also be calling some of us out on being against public safety. It's ridiculous. You cannot believe in public safety unless you believe in demilitarizing American streets and getting weapons of war off of them and out of the hands of criminal people who shouldn't have them. And that is a crisis that is a bipartisan issue. Our polling finds that many people, including Republicans, are at a point where they want to see significant gun legislation.
Are there certain current representatives from the GOP in the House that you can see working with? So specifically, there's a caucus in the Congress called the Problem Solvers Caucus. Can you envision becoming a part of that caucus? And are there folks on the Republican side of the aisle that you can envision working with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take a wait and see when I get there. It's definitely a caucus I would like to be a part of and get to know individual members themselves from both parties to see where we land on issues in common. But knowing and understanding, as we've talked about before, both parties come to that caucus with individual pressures from their own parties. And so where are the areas that we can agree, and where are we going to be able to move pieces of legislation? And particularly, I'm still hopeful that we hold the House. I think it's significant and important that Democrats do all that we can to hold the House right now, because, again, voting rights are at stake and significant policy issues that we really need to make progress on. But in the event that we didn't, I have no intention of going to Washington, D.C. to be a lame duck member. I want to actually get things done. And if a Problem Solvers Caucus is my way to do it, then absolutely I'll be at that table.
We'll put one vote in for you joining the Problem Solvers Caucus, although I understand it's going to be harder because a lot of Republicans who have been part of that caucus, John Katko, for example, are not going to be, or any number of the folks who voted for impeachment the second time around are not going to be part of Congress going forward. So it's going to be, I understand, at least for a time, it's going to be harder and harder to find folks to collaborate with across the aisle. But as one of your constituents or would-be constituents, I would vote. I would encourage you to work hard to find folks across the aisle that you can collaborate with. So I've been able to ask you a lot of what I wanted to as a follow-up here, but did you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so fascinated. I'm so grateful you brought me on again. And as you said, your audience is growing. And when you first, pitched this idea that you were going to be doing this podcast, your goal was, to bring people together on issues where we could agree to disagree or agree, but to be able to just have principled civil conversations, and just wanted to, check your pulse. How's it going?
I'm really grateful that it's going well. We face some obstacles because a lot of folks see that last part of the title of our program, without killing each other. Like, really? Can you do that? And we faced a lot of the typical comments, that are hidden behind these anonymous accounts lobbed our way all the time. But that's okay. I don't expect with this, program, even with our growing audience, we're still just a drop in the ocean. But you know what? I don't expect to snap my fingers and solve all of our problems of contentiousness overnight. But what I think I can do is I can talk to one human being at a time and make one human connection at a time. And for every person who's listening and then does participate in more constructive conversations in the other places where we engage with folks, whether it's out in person or just even in some of our online places, we are having constructive conversations. And the other thing, too, to keep in mind is that, when I do have a human connection, I don't expect somebody who is a big Second Amendment person to change their views completely and be on board with all kinds of reform. But maybe after I'm going out for a beer a little later this week with a friend of mine here in this valley, in this district, who, first thing you see when you walk into his garage is this huge gun, it's like a locker or whatever. So he's a big 2A guy, but so I don't expect him to be a big, to change his views 180 degrees after one conversation. But if my hope is simply to add some nuance to how he perceives folks who really do want some reform in that area, that's a win. But at the same time, I also have to remind myself that if I go in simply looking to prove him wrong or to change his views, I'm not going to get anywhere. But if I go in hoping to understand his views a little bit better, because I don't know, I don't know about 825. I don't know about that stuff. So if nothing else, maybe he can teach me why he's enthusiastic about it, why it's so important to him. Mm-hmm. And then we can have a more productive effect on each other, at least to have a more productive conversation about it than what you typically see online. So in that regard, I'm really encouraged to see some great conversations we've had across a wide array of folks. I will say the only lane that hasn't come on the program and that doesn't seem to be participating are those the election denying lane. So,
yeah,
folks, it's funny because even folks, like, the way I describe it is, if you could imagine folks that went to the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, there are folks like from my church that were all on board for that I can still have a conversation with. But I think the line for me is the folks who actually march down to the Capitol and storm the Capitol. So I want to hold out hope, but I have to be realistic that as Peter Wehner said in a recent conversation, there are some folks that are just not reachable, and we have to fight against those who can't be reached by reality, and fight against some of the tendencies, some of what's happening out in our culture and in our politics due to some of that, while at the same time holding out hope for folks that can be persuaded, which is why I asked you some of the questions that I did today.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the sweet spot. And especially when it comes to our elections. Okay, what are the ways that we can make this so transparent that voters who went down that path for a little while are willing to come back and still say, no, American elections are secure and accessible, and we believe in them, and we believe in the people who count the votes and give us the tallies, and can get behind, whoever is elected as our leader, as we had, done for a lot of generations in this country. We got to get back to that.
Great. So before we go, let us know, how can we find you online and about learn more about your campaign and all that good stuff?
Yeah, it's really easy. All the links you would need are at Christy, CHRISTY 4 FOR Congress.org. So Christy4Congress.org links you to everything you need.
Yeah, Christy with a Y, not an IE. Christy Smith.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to catch up with you. And I hope to see you in person, live, out on the trail here really soon.
I know, in person. Thanks so much, Corey.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please follow us, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts. And again, consider supporting us at patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us: by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.